Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content here should not be used as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only, and please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. This podcast should not be in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. There is no guarantee regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship.
Today's men's mental health. We're looking at that. I think it's going to be an interesting episode, a conversation, because we're different genders. We have different perspectives. So it's going to be interesting, your insights versus my insights on this topic.
You know what's so interesting is I was thinking, Tiffany, you are more of an expert on men's mental health than I am, like just with like the research and stuff. So I was like, I think it will be very interesting. And I think maybe gets at a point is like, we see, I know if I'm looking for a therapist for myself, like I see the picture, I see the video, but that may not tell us everything, like, oh, this person is an expert or this is what they're doing. Because I know I have learned a lot. Open endorsement of Tiffany. I've learned a lot from you working with my own male clients, just like, asking a question of how to do an intervention or something. So I think it'll be interesting. So if you're coming in thinking I'm the expert on men's mental health and then Tiffany's here, it's like, it's kind of the other way around. Tiffany is more the expert and I do that work, but I would consider Tiffany the expert on that.
Well, it's interesting because I came in going, all right, Eric's the expert. We're going to learn some stuff. So this might be, we might be ping
Well,
ponging
maybe
some
you
ideas.
you could speak from like the interventions and just you're more up to date, I think, on the research on it. And then I can speak as the lived experience of a man, but I don't want to disclude that expertise that you're bringing into the conversation today.
Yeah. So I guess to kind of kick things off, we'll kick it off pretty strong. One thing that really has always grated against me when it comes to men's mental health is the idea that real men don't ask for help.
Oh
How
yeah.
does that one sit with you?
It's funny because as a professional that sat with people working through that very idea, I totally am like, oh, that's not right. But as someone that's lived as a man, I feel like I understand what that phrase means, even though it's not really a straight up thing. So I do think maybe in like the United States culture, there is this big like value on independence and toughness for men. And I think there's nothing wrong with being gritty or tough. But it's like how far we take that and what that means. And so sometimes that idea goes too far where it's like I can't open up to anyone, not even like my partner. I can't like feel emotions with my kids. My kids can't see me make a mistake or be vulnerable. I'm not allowed to make mistakes at work. It can go like too far. And I think the sad part I've noticed, and I would maybe guess you have too, Tiffany, is that it keeps a lot of men from therapy until it hits a pretty big level of symptoms where it's,
Yeah.
man, this is a lot going on. And personally and professionally, I can say that that is the case. I have been that person, and I've also worked with many men who have been at that point where it takes a lot to bring them into therapy typically because of this idea like, oh, I should be independent or man up or I don't need anything kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think something that really frustrates me is how extreme our views of individualization in men and male population in general has come. Because when you look back at when we lived in teepees, there were hunting parties. Like not just one man went out and did the hunting, like the whole group of men came together and would go hunt collectively as a community to accomplish a task. Versus here and now, we're just like, oh, it's you're on this island, you have to do this. And it's like, that's not how humans function.
for you what it, because that's such a great analogy that I honest to God will use in the next week with a client, because I just love that, because that is like, we're not, you go back to like hunting mammoths and stuff, you can't hunt a mammoth by yourself, or even if you were like hunting buffalo, you know, like native, like, you know, the native descendants of this land, like hunting buffalo, like that wasn't a solo thing. Or even just like going out west. I feel like we're all, I don't know. I like the show Yellowstone. I know it gets some hate, but it's like, I think the idea of, you know, this mythology of being a cowboy and going west, like, you know, the Oregon Trail, they had parties of people. They had whole crews and they had stops, and
Oh yeah.
even like Lewis and Clark, there was a team, you know, it was a team, and they were led by Sacagawea, which I don't know. It's like, where, I don't know
Yeah.
where it came from, where it's like, you literally can't need anyone ever, because if you do, you're weak. I just, and I think we have to maybe just throw out, like, there's a whole
Yeah.
side of the internet that speaks to this, like, really, like, and I'm not going to plug any of those things, but just there is a side of the internet that gets at that, of like, hey, you know, it used to be like this for men, and let's go back, and it radicalizes people, and it's really doing huge disservices to their mental health. It's like radicalizing them and making them think that, you know, men are superior to women. So I just want to be really clear, that's not what we're saying, where things need to go back to where we're talking about working as a team, being a part of a community, being connected. So if you're looking for that
Yeah.
side,
Taking
if you're
care of
looking for
each
that side of
other.
the internet, you've come too far. This is not the conversation you're going to want to look for. You need to go
Please turn
somewhere
back
else.
now.
Yeah, I mean, or stay and listen to what we have to say. I don't judge you for how you've gotten there. I think the internet's really powerful, and algorithms are really
Hmm.
powerful. And man, like, you know, I don't know if you noticed this, but we, you know, I'm searching articles for men's mental health, and we're looking at stats, looking at stuff. And it was very interesting to see the ads and what my algorithm was kind of promoting, because it knows that I'm looking. It was very interesting what gets promoted. And so I think just putting that disclaimer out there for, you know, it's not all men that are dealing with that, but I do think a lot of men have felt prey to, you're in these, you know, echo chambers, and you're like, wow, like this is the only way to go. And it makes me sad, because it's like, yeah, that's there, there's community there, but there's community in other places. And I think as men, we typically struggle to build community more often. I think it's harder. I think there's just lots of men that I think feel very lonely, like they don't have friends, or they don't have like a friend group, or they don't know how to just
Hmm.
talk about the things. And so this is, again, it's not all men that are dealing with this, but I think if we're looking at some of the data, it kind of shows that this is a challenge for a lot of people, not just a few people.
Yeah, and just to kind of put it out there, at the end of the day, it takes way more courage, way more strength to step up and ask for help than ignoring your problems and letting them control your life.
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, one of the best decisions I've ever made was go to therapy personally, and it is something that has changed my life, made me a better human being, and just able to enjoy things. So, and I have a few stats, if that's okay, Tiffany, to throw out, just because I
Yeah,
think it
yeah.
would maybe help. So, this is from, I believe this is from the Center for Disease Control or National Health. 77% of men polled suffered common mental health symptoms like anxiety, stress, or depression. 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about their mental health. 29% of those who haven't done so say they're too embarrassed to speak about it, while 20% say there's a negative stigma. And I just have a few more, I promise. And the biggest cause of mental health issues in men's lives are work, 32%, finances, 31%, and their health, 23%. And this one, I'll just kind of hold off there, because there's like a probably like a different angle with some of these stats. But I think that just really speaks to, like, we know that not everyone who needs therapy is reaching out to
Yeah.
therapy, and looking at that of like, you know, 40% have, like, we're not even talking, just never like at all have ever talked with anyone about mental health stuff.
Yeah. It just sounds so heartbreaking to know there's so many individuals out there to just completely feel isolated with all of these emotions that are such a natural human experience to have.
Yeah. And one thing, it's ironic being a male therapist, but therapists is typically are female. I think it's like 80% of therapists are, in at least the United States, are female, which it's, and that's not like we love feminism and this is a power, but it's like, so it is harder if you're a man seeking to find a male therapist than if you were maybe looking to find a female therapist. And so sometimes that's something I've experienced with some of my clients. They're wanting to talk to someone of like a specific gender or like the lived experience part. But I also just want to throw a plug, like there are some amazing, obviously I'm talking with one of the amazing female therapists that also can understand and respect and support and help that have not lived as a man. And I say this because sometimes it's helpful to have that space, and you may be surprised what you would learn. There's nothing wrong with having a preference, absolutely, but I just want to throw out there that like I'm a substance use counselor and I've never struggled with like substance abuse issues, and so I don't say it with a judgment, but I didn't have to go through every single thing to be able to use my skills and knowledge to help someone. So it's just a shameless plug if you find someone that you feel like, hey, maybe I could try that out or see. And this is more of if you are ready to reach out, feel like you can't find someone that works or matches, but maybe it's just seeing the right fit. And but also honor your gut if that's not what's going to work for you. But just wanted to throw that out there because I know some folks have, like, when you're ready to go, it's kind of a tight window to start therapy. So I would hate for someone to miss that because they were like, oh, at this current moment it's just harder to find a male therapist.
Yeah, and something that I guess probably most people aren't aware of. I was raised in a household with 3 brothers and a dad. So like while I haven't lived the personal male experience, I got to see firsthand varying degrees, varying age ranges of the male struggle, and kind of had to live in it of like how like I can't help these individuals, but like how do I support them without them asking me to be supported?
Yeah. And that's a really interesting point because you've had more personal experience because it was just me and my dad. I have one sister and my mom. So it's like, you were getting more experience. So I think that just kind of highlights again, like, yeah, you don't know what everyone's experiences are or what they've been working with or going through. And so I think it just kind of highlights that there's different types of folks that can be helpful. And yeah, this is just a strong endorsement of female therapists. Like I have only worked with female therapists because I don't know, that was just something that felt helpful and safe for me. So that's what I did. And it was wonderful. And I never felt because I had great therapists that I was like, oh gosh, like if only they understood, that's my experience. Someone will probably have a different one, but that I'm a strong personal and professional endorsement for female
Yeah.
therapists.
Well, and to add to that, the male individuals that I work with um, have often disclosed to me that the reason they choose females is because they have a wider emotional intelligence. And that's not to say men can't have an emotional intelligence, but it's men aren't
That's fair.
offered the same opportunities that females have to grow that intelligence. And it can be really safe space to go to someone and say, hey, like, you have this intelligence. Can you
Yeah.
share it?
It may feel uncomfortable, but it may be easier to
hmm
get uncomfortable and vulnerable in that space because it's not like, I don't know, if you're carrying that stigma of I can't open up to another man. So yeah, we're so excited about this podcast episode specifically. I think when we started this, Tiffany was like, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. And so if you listened to us last time, we were like, as soon as it was done, we're like, okay, yes, we're going to do men's mental health, right?
Yes.
It's like, yeah, of course we are, because we're ready to do this. I was going to set you up, Tiffany. Is there anything as far as like statistics or anything you wanted to add on like the front end of what maybe keeps men
Um,
out of therapy?
I don't know. Like, I guess I could like list things forever about things that potentially keep men out of therapy. I do think at least from my experience, the biggest underlining kind of like hiccup is if someone finds out, I'm gonna be emasculated. I'm gonna be seen as weak. I'm gonna be seen as not strong enough. I'm gonna be undesirable. And that holds a lot of people
Mm.
back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I definitely register that. And I think I just want to throw out like, not everyone needs to be like, hey, I've gone to therapy and it was helpful. Like, you don't owe everyone your story in that. So I don't, if you're listening to this as like a person that maybe needs to or is thinking about going to therapy, like, don't feel like, hey, you have to be on like the therapy train now and hype it up and go like, you don't have to do any of that. I think some of us who have had such a transformational experience or maybe want to help fight the stigma and we're comfortable sharing because our wounds have healed. But like, if you're going for the first time to therapy, it's not like you need to go on social media and be like, I went to therapy for, it's like that's something that's between you and your therapist and doesn't need to be told
Yeah.
anyone else if
Yeah,
you don't
it's
want to.
it's a confidential safe space for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that alarmed me when I was doing my research, that's why I wanted to give you a chance. That's why I kind of paused myself. And it really, it has me kind of shook, if I'm being honest, when we were diving into this. So one of the statistics I found was 40% of men said it would take thoughts of suicide or self-harm to compel them to seek professional help. And that is just such an alarming stat that I want to just say it one more time. 40% of men said it would take thoughts of suicide or self harm to compel them to seek professional help. And I do find the wording of that so
Hmm.
interesting and telling, isn't it? Like, that's just to be open to seeking it. That doesn't even mean, hey, that's going on and I'm actually going to for sure connect. It just means, oh, yeah, if that happened, I would go and talk to someone. And it just blows my mind because that's how hard, this is indoctrinated in our culture for men of like, it's such a bad thing to air quotes, bad thing to go to therapy or be vulnerable or go. Or yeah, it's just so jarring. I don't know. How do you feel hearing that as a fellow therapist, someone that cares about men, hearing that
Well,
stat?
unfortunately, that stat's not new to me. It's not surprising. I know it's hard. It actually men are 3 times more likely to die from suicide than women. In certain countries, depending on where you're looking, 7 out of 10 people that commit suicide are males.
Yeah. I found from the CDC, males make up 80%
Yeah.
of all deaths by suicide. Yeah. Yeah. I So I think, what does that statistic mean to me as a therapist? Is like, I'm shook because as a therapist, I want to get in on that challenge or those symptoms as soon as possible because that's when I'm going to be way more effective to help heal or grow those skills or help with those symptoms. And so for someone waiting till it's a crisis, that's never too late to come into therapy and get things going. It's just going to make that so much harder. And I think about, there are things that make therapy work and things that make therapy not work. And so if you're waiting till a crisis point and coming in, it's like, well, I've gone to 4 to 6 sessions and it's not all gone, so therapy doesn't work. That I can see where someone could feel that way. I will always try to tell my clients, like, 4 to 6 sessions, you should see growth. Maybe we complete some of your goals, but if we're talking like complex trauma or kind of bigger things, it's very hard to get all that done that quickly. But I also want to throw out a disclaimer: it doesn't take forever as well. So it's like, I'm not saying us therapists, we
Yeah.
need you for your whole life, but we need time to go and figure out. And if it's someone's first time in therapy, they may not know what that looks like and what is helpful and what is not. And so yeah, just that shameless plug of like, like there's growth. It's just very hard to feel it. And that's why us as therapists, we try to help our clients see that growth and say, hey, like, you're staying calmer today, or hey, like, look at this week, you had less panic attacks, or your thoughts didn't last as long, that were unsafe for you. Like, that's the stuff we try to do to help people
Yeah.
see it, because it feels very flat, like all or none is what I think a
Yeah,
lot of
and I
people
think
fall into.
something to keep in mind is you're coming in to talk to a complete and utter stranger. Yes, they're a safe space, but they're still an utter stranger, and it takes time for both you and that stranger to make a connection to where you can
Mm,
really dive deeper into things in a safe and productive growth manner.
yeah. And some folks will come in and want to just stay at mild salsa for a little bit, and that's
Yeah.
okay, or medium, or get into like spicy salsa right away. Some people are just ready to go, and that's okay. And it's okay to just let a therapist know. Like, I've had clients say, hey, I don't really want to talk about that today, but maybe if we get to know each other. Also, sometimes I think the idea of having to write it all down can be triggering for people. Like, if they have to do the
Hmm.
paperwork, what's bringing you in. And so, just let your therapist know, say, hey, I'd really like to talk with you about this in person. That's okay. A therapist that reads that is going to know, hey, that person needs to say this out loud in person. That's safer for them. That's okay. I
Hmm.
fill it out if you can. It's helpful for us therapists to have as much info as possible. But if that really is not a possibility, that's okay to just say, hey, I'd like to come and talk to you about
Yeah, and
this in
I've had
person.
numerous individuals on their intakes just write, I'd rather tell you. And I'm like, okay, well, that's no big deal. Like it's not going to hurt my feelings if you don't fill out my ridiculous paperwork.
Yeah. So I think just speaking to that crisis point of like it's not a typical thing or a healthy thought pattern to think about, is life worth living, or am I, safe every day? Like that's not a normal, when I say normal, like a healthy, safe thing to have going on. And so if you're a man listening to this and that's something that you've maybe been struggling with or dealing with, like that is not a safe space to be in, and seeking help is wonderful. And so if I may just make a shameless plug, I really love working with veterans, and they are the toughest men I've ever met in my life. They are tough men. These are men that have been deployed, seen combat, seen a lot of things that no one should have to see, have done a lot of
Absolutely.
amazing things. And they're not less tough because they come and talk to me about what that cost has been for them, or hey, I want to be a better dad, or hey, I want to like be able to like let some of this go. Like the way I viewed their toughness does not change. If anything, it was hard, very, very hard for them to come in and be willing to work on some of that. And there's also some wonderful female vets too. So I'm not trying to just, to count them out, but I think of like, if those men are allowed to come in and talk, then all of us should be able to be allowed to talk, because those are tough people. And so if the idea of talking to a therapist means you're not tough, I was like, I don't know. I just picture all the vets I work with. It's like, they're the toughest men I've probably ever met in my life. Like, I mean, truly, I'll leave it very broad, but yeah, I have some images in my head of some of these men I've worked with. I'm like, man, I've never been like, I wish these guys were tougher. That's never been a thought I've
Yeah.
had about my veteran
Yeah.
clients.
Something that crossed my mind as you were talking was kind of the idea of what toughness means to different people. I think we can, well, I say we, and I think society in general can easily slip into that mindset of veterans have a higher toughness, so it's quote unquote okay for them to seek out help because they've dealt with so much stuff. And it's like, we're not here to compare trauma. We're not here to compare journeys. Like, everyone's life is different. Just because you have a different journey than someone who is a veteran doesn't make your experience, your emotions any less valid.
Yeah, I could see how someone could see it as like, oh, okay, I have to serve to talk about it. And I think if you talk to any veteran, they'd be like, no, that's not what that means. It means like it's okay to talk about things and be okay. And they are some of the most emotionally intelligent people I have gotten to interact with. And I think that's the thing, is like, hey, amongst like some of the toughest of tough, they're also checking in about feelings and how things are going. And they're not expecting every man to have served to be able to be qualified to feel
Hmm.
feelings. Like, you are allowed to feel feelings because you're a human being. You don't need to do anything to qualify to seek that
Yeah.
help or feel what
Yeah.
you're feeling.
I'm gonna shift a little bit because there's one of these statistics that always kind of catches people off guard. The myth that only women can experience eating disorders. So, men account for approximately 20% of individuals that present with
Mm,
anorexia, 30% of those with bulimia, and 43% of people with binge eating disorder. Between 55 to 75% of people with a specified feeding or eating disorder are male.
that's going to shake some things up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's not the stereotype of what I think people picture when
Yeah,
they
I mean,
picture eating
even as
disorders.
a therapist, like when someone mentions, "Oh, my friend has a eating disorder," my brain automatically defaults to imagining a woman. That's just what society and media paints as quote unquote eating
Mhm.
disorder image. So even when I was reading that, I was like, it's not really surprising, but it's really hurtful to think about how media portrays the image of what an eating disorder can and cannot look like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very powerful, I don't know, I think we're both very data driven, and so the numbers don't lie. So that's a very powerful statistic of like men are dealing with
Yeah.
those similar issues. What do you think, Tiffany, are kind of like any other misconceptions or like the bigger misconceptions about men's mental health that you think are just sticking around?
So I think there's a stigma around still being like the strong ones, the like primary person, the main person within a relationship. There's still this perception that they have to carry the relationship.
Mm,
Like I see this both
oh, yeah.
professionally and personally, where there's intermittent bouts of like, well, I'm not good enough because I don't have a fancy car. I'm not good enough because I don't have a 5-bedroom
Mm,
house. I'm not good enough because like I'm still living with my parents. And I'm like, you guys are like very tunnel vision
mm,
on like this societal idea of like what linear life should look like. When if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, like there's a lot of environmental changes that are occurring that just aren't allowing humans to accomplish goals in
yeah.
general.
Yeah. Man, no, I zoom out. I was like, yeah, it's not anyone's fault about if you're in the United States and inflation and the housing market and the job
Hmm.
market and like college loans and all this. Like that's we're everyone's dealing with different pieces, but it's definitely I think very hard for the current millennial men generation right now than maybe it was earlier. And I'm not saying all generations haven't had challenges, but I think right now it's pretty brutal. If you're like, oh, I need to go, like you said, I should be able to get a house and have 2.5
Hmm.
kids and have this or whatever it is, and the things, and it's like feeling like, wow, that's
Yeah,
really
and
hard right now to
expensive.
do. Yes, yeah, and I think that's something where in therapy, sometimes people can maybe come to see some of the systems impacting their
Hmm.
life, whether that be like religion or where they grew up, or if they've where they've worked in, like if they've worked in the military, they work for the government, or all those different things that can like play a part in shaping someone's world and
Yeah.
reality. Yeah. I do think this idea of being the tough one isn't maybe on its own a negative thing, but I think when that idea is taken too far, like we've been kind of talking about, where it's like you can't need help. And so, for example, like I drive a Honda Accord. I didn't make that car. I don't know how to assemble a Honda Accord engine. I don't know what to do if the engine blows up or something and I need to rebuild it. Like I don't. And I don't think that makes me less of a person. It just means that, hey, I'm going to need some help on something. So I think in that case, it's okay for me to seek help. If you have a plumbing emergency, it's okay to seek help. Like I think there's all these scenarios where it's like, yeah, that's okay to seek help. So if I broke my arm,
Hmm.
no man or person would be like, oh, well, they're weak because they broke their arm and they have a cast. I mean, maybe there's someone, but I don't think that's typical. And so it shouldn't be any different if someone's dealing with depression, anxiety, trauma, anger. And that kind of leads me into something of like, for all the men out there, like, you're feeling anger most often because that is the emotion that society says you are permitted to have most often. And Tiffany's going to smile
Hmm.
because as therapists, we love to talk about our primary and secondary emotions, but anger is typically a secondary emotion. Like if someone cuts you off in traffic, maybe you're angry because that happened, but maybe also you're stressed out. And that is how you're allowed to let out that stress energy is, oh, someone cut me off in traffic. Now I can murmur, or say 4-letter words or get all aggressive, like anger is allowed
Yeah.
to be felt then. And it's something you said earlier, Tiffany, of like, men having less practice typically to practice feeling emotions and have that breadth of like
Yeah, and I
emotional
can't
intelligence.
even begin to fathom being in a male's shoes, having to walk around on a daily basis looking for those little instances that are enough to either trigger me or set me off or break the wall that would give me the permission to be angry. Not only to let out my anger, but also to let out a little bit of that built up emotion. Only to be perceived by people that are watching me or significant people in my life to be like, you have an anger problem, when it's really so much deeper. And the anger problem is the only acceptable way to let things
Yeah,
out.
yeah. That's the only way that maybe a person would know how to let that energy out. So it's like, and have to let me put my generational trauma hat on for a second. But if your whole family generation, like 3 or 4 back, men were allowed to be angry, go off, whatever, and that's the only time you can remember seeing your father figure
Hmm.
show emotion. Like I'm not saying it gives you a free pass to be as angry as you want, but it makes sense why it's harder because you maybe didn't get a chance to practice that or use that skill or figure that out. And so, like if you're listening to this, you're like, okay, great. Now I know I'm angry, and now I know why it's so hard for me to reach out. Like, what do I do with that? And I would think just maybe see if you're willing to reach out for help. Like maybe this isn't the right time for you. I mean, I'd love for everyone that needs therapy to get therapy, but I don't want people to be forced into doing that. So, you may just have to take a second, like, I just don't know. I don't think I'm going to listen or be willing, because timing is so important, like so important for something like this. If you're choosing to work on some of this, so it's okay to be like, hey, I don't know if I'm ready. This is going on, but I will challenge you. If there's always a reason why this current season doesn't work, then you're just procrastinating and putting something off. But I do want to give folks space if it's like, no, really, like this is going on, so I really can't
Yeah.
find a way to
And
do
something
this
to
right now.
tack on to the generational comment you made. Generational anger is a really difficult cycle to break because that's your role model. That is the primary significant male role model. And if that's how they handled
Yeah.
anger and your brain has deemed, well, it worked for them, it can be really challenging to rewire that role model and that way to process through anger. So I guess the reason I threw that out there is to like help individuals recognize like it's not intentional or unintentional that you may or may not be expressing emotions through anger. It's just been a generational pattern that's just been taught because it's been acceptable for so long.
Our brains are very lazy. They like to be on autopilot and they like to not have to think about things. That's why I'm always getting pumpkin spice lattes because I
Yeah.
don't want to have to think about how to find my energy. We're not sponsored by Starbucks, but if you're listening to Starbucks, I am very open to that. And Tiffany will follow my coattails. So, but it is tricky, and it is something that we kind of have these responses, and our nervous
Mhm.
system can respond a certain way. And something I have sat with so many men and had this conversation, like, yes, this is anger showing up. Yes, we need to work on that. But you're activated and feeling very energized and triggered. And that's why you're responding that way. That's not you calm, sitting like in nature, feeling at peace. Like that's you activated, and activated people don't make grounded decisions, nor do collapsed, exhausted people. And so that's where it's like, how do we reshift that and make more time feeling at the top of that polyvagal ladder, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling calm. It's very hard to do, especially if you're feeling like you're living 80, 85% of the
Yeah,
time in
and
the
something
activated
to
range.
add on to the brain and being lazy is your brain does like to be on autopilot. It's doing two 24/7 jobs for you, and if it can say this is easier and causes me less energy so you can focus on quote unquote other things that might be important, let's do it because like I don't want to spend the energy learning a new skill and like redistributing my functions.
Yeah.
I'm
So
sorry. I was just gonna finish my thought
go
and say,
ahead.
because like ultimately your brain at the end of the day is saying like I could be using that energy that you're trying to put towards learning a new skill to keeping you alive. So you're taking away from my primal function.
I told you guys, Tiffany is an expert. And I feel like if there was ever a time for you to shine, Tiffany, I feel like a hype man, which is okay. But you are dead on. It's trying to save energy, it's trying to save it for something else. And so we just have to be kind to ourselves that this takes
Hmm.
time to shift, to change, to retangle some of these nervous system connections, to heal, to grow. And so I just want to encourage people like, this is happening every day. Like you may not be connected to the therapy world, but men are going into therapy offices every day for the first time. They're making changes, they're making growth. And I think it's getting better. I think, if you asked me to do this podcast as a grad school student, there was no chance in hell that I would come in and talk about what my
Hmm.
personal lived experience with mental health is. And I was trained to be a therapist. So I think just it speaks to like I don't think it's really my internal growth, but just things are shifting a bit. Like men need to be able to talk about these things, and we're challenging
Yeah.
some of the stigma. Um, I am an Indianapolis Colts fan. Sad to say after the Browns game, but one of the coolest things they do is there's this whole campaign called "Fight the Stigma," and it's all about just mental health for everyone. But I'm telling you, it really hits me every year when they do these little videos, and it's like all these athletes that, I'm cheering to destroy and decimate, the other team and score. And then they're sitting there like, yeah, I have anxiety. Yeah, it's stressful. Hey, I need to talk to people. And they're millionaires, they're athletes, they have fame, success, whatever, but they're still people and they still have the same stuff going on. And so I just think, do we have to have those things? But if people who are having more support are also having those things, like, then what are we as other just typical guys feeling, right? And having those experiences. So I think it's just a normal experience that, hopefully it just keeps getting better each generation, but it's normal to have mental health things going on. It's not crazy. It's not, oh my God, like no one's ever dealt with this. Like, no, it's just we as men haven't talked about this as much as maybe our counterparts, and have had the chance to kind of practice this or use this or recognize this, and so hopefully
Yeah.
that keeps getting
And I
better.
think it's groundbreaking that people that have this spotlight that we kind of put on a pedestal are normalizing the human experience, because everyone on the face of the planet is somewhere on the anxiety spectrum.
Absolutely. And just a shameless plug, we're talking about community. There are so many other ways, speaking to my folks in recovery, there are tons of ways to have a good time that doesn't revolve having to
Mhm.
be at a tailgate drunk or at a bar drinking. Like, that is not what being a man is. That can be a part of someone's experience, but like there are lots of things we can do to connect with other men that does not have to involve substances of any kind. And you may be like, how do I do that? Like, that's probably a good size. Like, well, maybe you're feeling a lot of stress and anxiety, but it's like, that's it, would not recommend that path of self-medicating to be in social situations. Like, we got to find some ways of connecting and maybe starting
Yeah.
smaller somewhere. But there are lots of things we can do to connect with other
Yeah,
people that
there's
don't involve
board game
substances.
nights, there's trivia nights, I mean, I've had individuals throw movie nights or just go camping or, just going on short little hikes. There's all kinds of different ways to connect with each other. And if you're struggling in that space of like, well, I really enjoy the socializing and drinking and hanging out, they do make non-alcoholic alternatives that are healthier, so you don't have to feel like you're putting yourself and your health at risk if that's not something you want to do.
Yeah, I think it's a very cheap take on masculinity to say my masculinity is like I have slept with
Mhm.
this many people who are are at this level of attractiveness, or I can drink this much. Like, that's very cheap. Like, not judging people. If you enjoy a drink, that's your business. But like, to define all of who we are as men off those things, I think is very
Plastic?
cheap. Yeah, I don't want to judge folks because we're
Mhm.
all on our own journeys, right? But I really have a strong reaction, like that's the way we should be identifying and scoring ourselves. So I guess I will make a definitive statement if I don't think that is the way we should define ourselves as men. I think that's kind of cheap and shallow. And I think it kind of makes it, I don't know, it just puts us in this very unhealthy range. And it's just not, I don't know. I don't know if you've noticed the folks who have gone to college, had their traditional college experience, and then they get into the real workforce and then they start to feel some things and deal with stuff. I don't know. But that's a lot of some of the men I've worked with where now they're out of college and they've settled in. And now all that stuff that they could have been working on for that time but didn't, now it's like hitting. So I'm not judging any of those folks, but it's like it is a typical pattern
Mhm.
I think therapists see. I'm not the only one. And so it's just something to kind of throw out there of like why I'm like, I don't think that's a helpful way to define masculinity and
Yeah.
therefore your
And I
worth.
know we could probably go all day on this topic. It's such a fascinating and needed discussion. But before I kind of wrap us up here, is there anything left, Eric, that you want to add to or touch on?
Mm, just like to not to not close that door all the way, I think, is the only thing I would ask. Like, so if you're not ready to start that process, like, I just don't want you to feel like you have to shut that door all the way. Like, I think I would just ask, if you're someone that, hey, I have this stuff going on but I'm not sure if I can face that right now, like, that's okay. I have no judgment for you, but just don't shut that door all the way, because I find that it's really hard to open it back up all the way versus if we leave it cracked. last thing I have to say, is there anything else that you would
Yeah,
share,
so kind of
Tiffany, on
just
this?
following in on your coattails on that statement of just if you don't find that therapy's for you, that's okay. This isn't like we're telling you to go. There are plenty of Discord channels, online threads, online support groups, local support groups, anonymous support groups. Find something that works for you and start there. Everyone's journey is different. Everyone's desire to be supported will look different in a different way, and that's okay.
Mhm. I really appreciate this discussion, Tiffany. And like like it's not a lie. Like I always learn something when I talk with Tiffany. So I'm just like sometimes I'm like, am I the target market for this? No, it's like I'm taking something from it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you felt like you could take something from it. I definitely personal disclosure closure came in going, oh man, I don't know how much I can be contributing to this conversation because I don't have the lived in experience. I'm not in the I'm not in the know, so to speak, as some
Mhm.
people would say.
Well, I appreciate the dialogue, and we will look forward to catching you guys next time when we bring our next topic.
Yeah, keep tuned in. You never know um what will be next.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Growth is a journey. Taking it one step at a time is okay. If you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to contact us on social media. We love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.